It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Roenneberg, known to some of you in the audience, but maybe not everyone, so I'll do a brief introduction to it, if that's all right. Professor Roenneberg is Professor of Chronobiology at LMU in Munich, in Germany. Many of you will know about his long-standing and indeed groundbreaking work on chronotypes, and specifically tools like the Munich Chronotype Questionnaire. And of course, how that relates to adverse effects on health from circadian disruption, including social jet lag, shift working, mental health, and all of that stuff. So this is of great interest to me personally, as for a research focus, but also it's really, really relevant increasingly to mental health in general. So I'm very much looking forward to your talk, Till. And with that, I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much for coming.
Well, thank you very much for this nice introduction. And indeed, circadian biology is extremely interesting for practically everything that concerns biology. How do I do this? I have to press got it first?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, left. All right. Yeah. So that could be my only conflict of interest, because ever since I retired, I continued working by having a company doing the analyses, not for a co-authorship, but for a bit of money. And I'm not taking any money out of that company for myself, but I'm using it as an infrastructure for continuing to do what I like to do. And it's a great arrangement. It's sort of like having your own granting agency, because you can take money out and use it for your research. I've paid light bulbs for experiments in the Brazilian jungle. I'm flying post PhD students from one end of the world to another. So it's a great system, and it just replaces what we used to have at the university. So I'm going to, since I don't know who is the background of everybody, I'm going to take a small tour into chronobiology, not going into the details of the circadian clock that much, because I presume that everybody who is here sort of has access to the literature of knowing what a molecular feedback loop is and how the 24 hours are generated. But I would like to take a step back, or fly as a bird above chronobiology, because I think we have to be reminded that chronobiology is a really basic facet of life on Earth. And then I will go into the consequences of how we are treating our inheritance that we got in order to deal with the cyclic environment that we have in industrialization. And it's very typical of humans to think that they know better than evolution, know better than God, in quotes, and just do things not taking into account the biology of the individual, and thereby you come into a situation where what I now call the health disease balance is tipped. So, short introduction into chronobiology. And it's important to understand that there are millions of rhythms out there in the world. They can be biological or they can be physical, but most of these rhythms are shaped by the environment. So a heartbeat is shaped by the environment of the heart, of the individual's environment. But there are 4 rhythms on Earth that actually shape the environment in a very, very predictive way. And it's always interesting that it takes one a long time to understand simple things like this, that most of the rhythms are shaped by, and only the 4 are shaping the environment. And it's these 4 that have developed biological clocks, because if you have something which is so regular that it is predictable, and that's being regular is the prerequisite for being predictable. So if a train leaves at 9 o'clock every day, or a plane leaves at 9 o'clock every second day or every day, It is predictable, and therefore we have developed clocks in order to know when these predictable things happen. And one of the environments where things are predictable are the tidal, are the coastlines, where it is very important to know when there's water above you or whether you're submerged in water or not. And it's also important for animals that feed off these creatures to know when they can reach them easier or not. So the tidal rhythm with its 12.5 hours is the shortest of the rhythms that shape environments. The next one is the Okay, that's interesting. Makes you aware of the power that the world has on you, just unmuting it. Okay, so the important thing about when a chronobiologist wants to know whether something has a clock for one of the 4 rhythms, the prerequisite is that you can show that it continues without getting input from these environments. And concerning the lunar clock, this has been done with the antlion, and the antlion makes cone-like structures, and it sits at the bottom and hopes that ants will fall down the slopes, and actually throws up sand to help them fall even faster. And it's then eating the ants. And what's circulunar, and the word circa is very important in these biological rhythms, because when you look at them without getting an input, when they're not synchronized by the actual rhythmic environment, they still can do the rhythm, but it's circa. It's not exactly 24 hours in the case of the day, and it's not exactly the lunar cycle when it's a lunar one. What's circulunar in this case is the size of the pit they make. So they make a very nice lunar rhythm in making bigger and smaller cones for ants. Okay. Stop share? No, I shouldn't say stop share, but next. Do I have to do this now every time?
I think we just
okay.
Zoom have taken your mouse.
They not only muted me, they're taking my mouse. Okay, so several publications in the last couple of years have shown that there is, at least on the epidemiological level, as you can see here, there is some kind of a lunar rhythm in humans. This is by Christian Kajochen, and it's the sleep latency that is the longest in full moon, when there's full moon, and shortest when there is a new moon. I believe the data, but as a biologist, I'm always a bit critical about if organisms make available information about themselves without getting very much advantage out of that. So it's the burglar's theory. Don't tell everybody that you're on a holiday, because otherwise the burglars will come. And the same thing is in biology. Don't tell too much of yourself unless you get a big reward for it. And there are rewards for being circadian, and I don't see the rewards in humans for being lunar. More recently, Charlotte Förster and Tom Weir and others have shown that the female reproductive physiology has aspects of very interesting aspects of lunar rhythms. So lunar rhythms in humans, and we've talked about, Danny, we've talked about the fact that bipolar patients show also lunar or I think lunar rhythms. So we jump to the seasonal rhythms, the annual rhythms, which are characterized mainly by changes in day length, photoperiod. And this is an animal example of a rodent that has been kept in constant conditions. Constant conditions for annual experiments is that you don't change the photoperiod. You can have an LD cycle, but you don't change the photoperiod. And then you can have, again, a free run. And these are the years from top to bottom. And these are the months. So this is 1 year. And you can see that they're still circa annual, but they're not exactly 365.5 days. No, 25 should be 0.25 days, shouldn't it? And then there is this phenomenal feature of reproduction where you go into some rodents and you find that the testes are just exploding at a very, very certain photoperiodic time in the year. And that has been subject of a lot of jokes too. Then there is the annual rhythm in humans, which sort of has gone down the drain in industrialization, but in the old days, there was a very strong rhythm when people were born. And for many, many decades, one thought that it has something to do with events around birth. That you have flu virus epidemics and so forth around the time of birth. And very early in my career, I investigated the annual rhythms and birth rates. And I very quickly came to the conclusion it's not birth, it's conception. So it's an annual rhythm in conception rates. So whenever you hear something about flu around the time of birth, I would not believe it. But it's been very strong until sort of the mid of the last century in many countries, and it had a very global gradient. It had global latitudinal gradients, so that they were earlier towards the equator than they were further away from the equator. Many things play into this system, and you can see that I'm separating the non-American countries and the American countries because the American countries, probably due to a shift in their temperature rhythms, behave slightly different, but it's very, very systematic. The interesting thing is that these things exist for mortality rates, for suicide rates. You can win a lot of money by asking people when they think is the maximum of suicides, because most of them will say they're around November, December, but that's not true. They are around the world very close to the summer solstice. So the maximum amount of suicides is with a long photoperiod. But even more interesting is that there are probabilities of developing something that you might develop only when you're 20 or 30, or even get something when you're older. And I'm not going to go into this, but it's something that I'm fascinated by, and we can discuss this over a glass of whatever. What could be behind the fact that people who develop schizophrenia are more likely to be born at a certain time of year, and even people who get strokes. And practically, if people looked, you would probably find most of what people could get is linked to when they were born, only with a very slight probability, and maybe not anymore because the annual rhythms are going down the drain, but still. So, but the main focus of this talk is going to be the daily, the circadian field or domain. And I'm shortening this introduction to a very, very dogmatic statement, and that is practically all organisms use light and darkness to created by the Earth's rotation as the main Zeitgeber for their clocks to synchronize. Zeitgeber is a German word, time giver, that is a special word for all the signals of the cyclic environment that actually can be used to entrain clocks. And synchronization is an active process. In humans, we have a brain, hopefully, And the system of the circadian system uses something that was called master clock or pacemaker for many, many decades. I sort of shy away from this role because I think the role of the superchiasmatic nuclei that are a paired nucleus above the optic chiasm is nothing else than to collect the information from the outside and provide a cyclic environment for all the clocks that are inside, because we now know that every cell has a clock. And there are people in this room who would even say, and I make me very happy by doing so, that you don't really need a nucleus to do this, but there are circadian rhythms in cells throughout the body, and they have to synchronize like organisms do to their cyclic environment. And therefore, I always say that the SCN is not the master clock, but it is the sun of the cells in the body. It just provides the rhythmic environment so that every cell can actively choose to be early or late, for example, in this environment. Something that is very important for circadian biology is that you have a choice. You can be adaptive if you need to be earlier or later. This is just to make you aware of the fact that, of course, everything is embedded in physiology. Nowadays, we have all these disciplines, and it's molecular biology and medicine and psychiatry and biochemistry and metabolism, but it's all physiology, because the physiology is how all of these functions are regulated. That is physiology, and therefore you have the circadian clock, the entire behavior, and sleep as part of physiology, and their interactions will impinge on the health disease balance. And of course, what we've already talked about is that we have environmental zeitgebers that are used. They don't synchronize. They are used by those systems actively as information to synchronize. And then we have other rhythmic cues that are very important, of which I believe they're not true zeitgebers. So I don't believe we humans have social zeitgebers. I think they only have light-dark zeitgebers. And if you can synchronize a human with social cues, I think the effects on the system are so weak in humans that their period there has to be already very close to 24 hours so that they can be synchronized, let's say by activity or by regular meals. Of course, we know that the liver can be synchronized by food. It's an active process. So this is actually me several years ago, traveling from Munich to Brazil, and from Brazil to the US, and back to Europe. And this is I kept, in those days I didn't wear the actimeter constantly, but which records the activity, but I kept sleep logs. And what you see is I'm flying west, that there is for me as a late type a relatively fast adjustment to the new light-dark cycle, which is shown here in the background. But if I'm flying back home, it takes quite a long time until I adjust to the new local light-dark cycle. And here is a one-page guide to entrainment of humans. As day-active animals, we should, because we are good, as long as the light's on, we are good out there. We are good at what we're doing. If we turn lights off, we're not that good. And therefore, it is clear that over the course of evolution, that we wouldn't be hunting around in the dark and sleeping during the day, but sleeping practically predominantly at night and being active during the day. And this relationship between activity and sleep, as it is shown here, is variable in different humans, but it is there. And again, like I've just shown sleep logs, if one could do sleep logs of people who are pre-industrialized, you would see a sleep log that shows sleep starting sometime after sunset and waking up sometime around dawn. to probe this, and Danny mentioned it, we have developed the MCTQ, which is different to other measurements because of two things. First of all, because it really takes people by the hand and puts them into bed and out again, and therefore it makes sure that we know what we're talking about. Now, one of the most sloppy things that sleep research has introduced is the word bedtime, because it comes out of the clinic of the sleep clinic where people are put to bed and the lights are switched off, but that's not sleep onset, and therefore I always hated the fact that they have questionnaires asking about bedtime, especially in young people, because you can put young people to bed and they will find, since they're very late chronotypes, as you will see, will find other things to do before they actually fall asleep. So we're taking people, getting them into bed and out again without questions. And it was just flabbergasting that nobody separated these questions for work days and free days, which turns out to be essential and gives you some hint towards the biology behind this circadian behavior. What you come out with is a distribution, a nice, not quite a normal distribution, but I think one can explain why there's an overhang of late people here. But basically you get a biological distribution of a trait, and these categories that are shown here in color are totally arbitrary, because they depend on the population. Psychiatrists in the US tried to create times at which somebody would be an extreme early type, so that in a way that it would be a disease almost. And of course, if you do that, you forget that that this exact timing you would choose would make most of the Indian population ill, because they are basically much earlier than we are in the industrial countries, and that has its reason. Now, the word birds and owls have been used right from the start as describing the early birds and the late birds. I didn't like that so much because it always prompted a bimodal thinking, namely there are owls and there are larks. And that was one of the reasons why I invented the doves, because then you can say, yeah, the owls and the larks are the extremes of the distribution, but the majority are the doves. They're somewhere in between, getting across to journalists mainly that that this is like dwarfs and giants. It's the ends of the extremes, and not something that is two group, that have the mixed crew groups. So what's behind a chronotype? There is, of course, genetics, and I don't know why that didn't. And I don't go into this because the entire circadian biology, true biology, has shown up to the Nobel Prize that genes are involved, and if specific genes are involved in the phenomenon, then you expect that there is inheritance and genetics. And what's more important is that there is, and we still don't understand enough of that, there is, of course, the influence of age. And the influence of age is one of the big, excellent examples that you can do something which everybody knows, and it's still necessary to do it. Everybody knows that adolescents are late. Teenagers and adolescents are late. But what you have to do is to make, and with the MCTQ, we get something like 300,000 people into a database. At that time, it wasn't that many, but still more than we needed, as some people say. But then if you split it up into actual annual age groups and females and males, then you can still, with these large numbers, look at a very good trajectories, and you can see that from early childhood on, the clocks, and all of these are distributions. So it's not that they are very narrow, they are relatively broad distributions. And even in babies, you already can find early ones and late ones, but as the age group, they get later and later and later. And the female age groups turn around to become early again about 2.5 years before the males do. They become very similar once it doesn't matter so much anymore what you are. So, but there's another thing which I always point out, which is utterly unscientific, because this graph also shows you why, on average, females marry older males. Because if they marry the same age, they always are early compared to the male. But if they marry in this direction, yeah, they can get the same chronotype, which is actually not a good thing to have. It's much better in reproduction with young babies to have very different chronotypes. So one can take the baby in the evening and the other one can take the baby in the morning. And I predict that that will save the marriage much more than being the same chronotype. So the last big effect on chronotype is, of course, light. And this is one of my favorite graphs where we took the MCTQ database and just put pixels of latitude and longitudes of a fourth of a latitude and a fourth of a longitude, and then color coded early and late as from bright green to bright red. And you can see this wave from east to west, from early to late. It looks like it's going up north, and it could be because we also have shown that the further north you go, the later the population becomes. But I think this is an artifact of the fact that French people just don't fill out questionnaires, which is fine. But I've tried everything that I can't get them to participate in a global questionnaire thing. Same with Spanish people, but we haven't tried as hard. But the French, we really tried, and they just don't do it. Okay, so and I'll come back to that later. That shows that there is a huge difference between people who live, for example, in Budapest and those who live in the north west of Spain, in Galicia, and they all live in the same time zone. So the question is, are they really earlier, or are we already slowly marching to what is what I call the consequence of industrialization? Because large time zones is one of those consequences. They are purely political. That's where we're going now. You've seen this picture, but you haven't seen what we have now. And what we have now is very subtle on this graph, on this slide, because you have to look at the shading of the top panels. The shading of the top panels shows a lot of blackness during the night and a lot of light during the day, and less light during the day and less darkness during the night, because we now have electrical light, and also due to the electricity and due to industrialization, we move inside, and therefore we get up to 1,000-fold less light than we would if we still were working outside. So that's decreasing the maximum of the Zeitgeber, and then we switch on lights after darkness, after sunset, and therefore we decrease the other part of the Zeitgeber. And for most people, that means that the clocks have to become later in order to still be synchronized. So since it's a very, very specific way how clocks react to light and darkness, in order to synchronize a clock to a 24-hour day with a weaker Zeitgeber, most clocks, and one could argue all those clocks that produce days that are slightly longer than 24 hours, have to become later in order to synchronize under weak Zeitgeber conditions. And those who have clocks, the early birds, who have clocks shorter than 24 hours, become even earlier, and thereby pulling apart the chronotype distribution. So another effect of this is that since the start times of our social events like schools and work and so forth haven't changed as much as our biological clocks have, we have introduced the necessity to wake up with an alarm clock. And waking up with an alarm clock is nothing else but going to a modern washing machine, although you can read that it takes another 45 minutes to finish the program, to switch the button and say that should be enough. And then you get dirty and wet laundry, and similar when you wake up with an alarm clock, things haven't finished up, which should have happened during sleep, and you have dirty and wet laundry in your brain. In any case, what it introduced is another rhythm, and that's the weekly rhythm. Because of course, if you have to wake up during the work week with an alarm clock, you deprive yourself of sleep. You have to live earlier than your biology wants you to do, and you make up for that on the weekend. Now, in order to understand what's going on, systematically understand what goes on with industrialization, I have started many years ago collaboration with Brazilian colleagues, because there is a group of people in Brazil who are called the Quilombola. And the Quilombola are former African slaves that at the end of the 19th century or the second half of the 19th century said, I don't want to be a slave anymore. And they just took off into the large areas of Brazil where nobody can get them. They have stayed a very close community until today, with the wonderful side effect for people like us that you still can find communities living without electricity somewhere in the mountains, or you can have communities within a town and they still live in communities in towns who have had electricity for a long time and who go and work from 9 to 5. And if you look at the different Quilombo populations that we looked at all over southern Brazil, you find that there is a gradient between how long you had electricity, or if you don't, and how late you are. So the longer you had electricity, the later you become. And I don't think it has something I think that the gradual delay is most probably due to the fact that the longer a region is linked up to the electricity, the more rural their behavior becomes. It's not that they have adapted to that or something like that, but it's just that the smooth gradient is due to showing something else, and that is the longer a region has electricity, the more urban it will become. Ken Wright has done a wonderful experiment where he actually proves that we haven't changed much, because if you take a normal urban population with a broad chronotype distribution on a camping trip, then everybody moves closer together and you form an earlier and a very narrow distribution, and a narrower distribution of chronotypes, which means that the retrospective analysis of why we are so broad becomes slightly validated by an experiment like that. Now, I've already alluded to the fact that we have to wake up with an alarm clock. These are, at the beginning, we had mostly sleep logs, hundreds of sleep logs, which we analyzed. And as you can see, not all of them are labeled properly. You have obviously days where people said it's a work day, but they didn't go to work. And others that are clear work days because they wake up every day at the same time. And they can't make any mistakes in noting that into the diaries because it's very obvious. It was 6 o'clock. And the reason for their sureness is obvious. It's this alarm clock banging its hammer on the brain. Interestingly, only 13% of the population does not, in the industrialized world, does not suffer of social jet lag. The rest suffers of social jet lag. And a more recent study that took advantage of the lockdown showed that actually 20 minutes of social jet lag, and social jet lag is defined as how far away are you from your biological clock when you have to live by the social clock. 20 minutes is acceptable and will not be changed in large populations. So when you analyze large populations, when you go from the normal to the lockdown situation, whereas everything else is being adjusted for the biology behind the individual. This is a boring graph because it shows nothing else but that sleep duration depends on age, is age dependent. You sleep much less when you reached adulthood than you did when you were a child. It's boring because it's been known. What's not boring is if you separate this into work and free days. And there you see the biology acting on sleeping shorter the older you get. And here you see society acting on it. And you can see that, of course, the social jet lag of these poor young people who have to go to school, whose clocks are extremely late, have to suffer most. And if you look at sleep duration in general as a relationship to social jet lag, you get an enormous decrease in average weekly social jet lag in people who are late types. So if we think about health and clock, we should never forget that being late by itself is not the disease. Being sleep deprived is the big disease. Being forced to eat and live against one's own physiology is the culprit of potential health consequences. Just a sip of water. Okay, last chapter. Circadian clock and health. You've seen this picture. And the reason why I'm putting it here is because more recently, very nice studies have been published. And this just shows you when people switch off their lights in the United States. And what you can see is that at every time zone, they switch it off later, and then within the time zone, there's a nice gradient, and it hits the border of the time zone, and it gets later again. No, but actually, this is the average sunset time in the counties, but or not even counties. Yeah, I think counties. But you can do the same thing when you look at when they're switching off their lights. And what you can now show is that if you look at, for example, obesity, diabetes, acute myocardial infarctions, or any other heart diseases, stroke, or breast, collateral, and prostate cancer, if you put these together to make a health index, you will see the further west you go in a time zone, the less healthy is the more you are challenged to produce some kind of an illness. That is the direction of increasing social jet lag. The further west you live, away from the eastern border of your time zone, the further away your body clock lives from the sun time, and it actually goes by sun time. So similar results have been shown for other diseases than the ones that I mentioned below. Here's a very recent paper, which I love because it's so simply done. It looks at social jet lag and car accidents, and it evaluates nothing else but the fact that the borders of the originally planned time zones are extended to the west of the time zone. So this is where the yellow should start, but these counties have decided to have their social time start like the time zone once over. And now all they did is they looked at what they called the eccentric time localities, the ETLs, and looked at the fatal traffic accidents, and it was almost 22% higher than the others. And of course, there are lovely geographical controls in there, and this is why the simplicity of this study is so wonderful. Time zones are challenging the system. If you look at Europe, for example, what the time zone that what countries should be in is shown by the back background color. And you can see that under normal time conditions, standard time conditions, England is very nice within the time zone. No wonder. I mean, they sort of came up with the concept. Whereas the poor Icelandic people and the Portuguese people, again, are outside. And we don't know how much that influences their health or their likelihood to have an accident. If you now put this into standard DST, you see that these people have to live in this area. So it's 2 time zones over. Everybody is moved 1 time zone further west, or has to go to work in 1 time zone further east, meaning that all of you guys in Edinburgh have to go and work in Oslo or Frankfurt, and all the Frankfurt people have to work in Moscow. I think Frankfurt, Moscow is even more picturesque and drastic example. And the third graph here shows what should be done. And of course, the European Union always says we can't separate France and Germany into 2 time zones. We've had so much trouble in getting them out of their war activities against each other, which of course is nonsense, because if you would give France the opportunity to be more special and less German, they would take it immediately. And if you would say the Germans are smack in their time zone, they would do it too. So I don't believe that there is a necessity to have the same time zone anywhere, especially not if you live close in Madrid and still have to live the same time as in Prague. Which, by the way, shows you how stupid it is to think that everything is cultural. We are so convinced that Spanish people eat late. And it's indeed the case that if you go to a restaurant and try to get a table, you will have difficulties in getting it before 9:30 or even 10 o'clock. But by some time, that means it's 7:30 in summer when we have DST. And 7:30 is a very decent time to eat. So they only eat culturally. It's political. Now I'm coming to the end because I think I've gave you enough fodder to think about the importance of the circadian clock and the consequences of industrialization for the health disease balance. But what I want to do now is show you a couple of examples and to make you aware. And this is was fun to write with Russell and Beth. This sort of conceptual review of what circadian medicine is, and how circadian system impinges on the health disease balance. The health disease balance, I basically invented this term in this review because I found myself in every sentence being hooked up or being slowed down in my thinking that circadian clocks are cause of disease and circadian clocks support health. And all of the, you have to rephrase it every time you think about it. And therefore I said to myself, it's like larks and owls. It's not 2 states, it's a continuum. And there's an etiology, and this etiology already involves a lot of possibilities of not going down the whole way until you get into the hospital or until you fall sick, until you develop a fever, until you develop real symptoms. We are attacked every second of our lives by something, and we are not falling sick every time. So, but in this etiology, you already have an enormous amount of circadian influence. It modulates whether we fall sick or not. It doesn't make you sick, but living against your clock modulates the efficiency of preventing the etiology to progress into an illness. And once you get ill, of course, how you treat the illness on the medical level is, again, extremely modulated by the circadian clock, and the recovery is too, when you give a drug. And so the whole pathway is modulated by the circadian clock. And here is a wonderful example of how you can put these two together. Luisa Pilz and Nicoli from Brazil are investigating the quilombos, and they used a very well-known variable, and that's intraday variability. How compact is your daily behavior? Is it fractionated, is it fragmented, or is it compact? And the larger you get here, the more variable it is. And when you look at pathology by in this case, questionnaires and also very superficial measurements like blood pressure and things like that, and you put this together, you can see that both are correlated. Pools. Actimetry, I've mentioned it several times before. We started a bit late, right? So I still have a couple of minutes. So this is, for everybody who doesn't know that yet, this is the way that circadian biologists look at time, and that is days go from top to bottom, and what we do at what time every day goes from left to right. And since like in the case of sleep, it is cut off at midnight, what we do is we take this and we move it over one day and move it up one day, so that we have day 1, day 2, day 2, day 3, and now we have a double plot. You can triple or whatever plot if you want, but this gives us the possibility of seeing the behavior as it is, not as in an artificial duplication, but in a true duplication, day 1, day 2, day 2, day 3. So long-term actimetry. And then we spoke about this. You say you want 6 months, and I think that is absolutely great. But I say under 6 weeks, you don't get it. You don't get a good notion of the behavior of this person. And what you can see here is that sleep, which is the lack of activity somewhere in here, varies, and it is embedded into nature, because we know where the people live, and therefore we know when there's dawn or dusk. So there's a natural change over the 6 weeks, and it is embedded into the social life of modern societies, and that is the work week and the weekend. And you can see that most of the variability already can be explained purely by the social structure. So I showed you at the beginning, I said we only had sleep logs. We meanwhile have an enormous amount of long recordings of actimetry, and it's beautiful. The sleep logs were just right. We move actimetry now into psychiatrics, and you can see that this schizophrenic patient is actually not synchronized in winter when you measure his or her activity. These are data by Katharina Wolf and Russell. And in summer, the actimetry, and this is melatonin measurements. You see, it's always very important to get something else, because behavior can be masked. There are stories by blind wives of truck drivers, and when they're home, they look synchronized, and when they're not home, they look as if they were free running. But if you look at it, including the measurement of melatonin, you see that the synchronization of the blind woman when the husband was home is not true. Okay, so that's why it's always very important to have also another measurement. Then you have things like mild dementia and severe dementia, and of course the behavioral of time. The sicker you get, it's not only psychiatric sickness. The sicker you get, the more fragmented is your life, and the less solidified is your behavior. This is a lovely example given to me by Anna, and this is a change of a drug in a patient with early Alzheimer's, and the first drug had a catastrophic effect on the day. On the daily behavior, and the change of the drug picked up the behavior again. This is I love this graph because it enables me to make you understand what I mean by empathetic data analysis. So this is a person who is sighted, but who cannot synchronize. And if you look at this, it just runs through, and this is a long recording, runs through the photoperiod or the light dark cycle. Just no synchronization whatsoever. And Sarah and I did this together several years ago. But now circadian analysis kicks in and says, let's plot this not on how we see the world, but on how this young woman or the physiology of this young woman sees the world. So basically on the average, we create an average day of her world. And then you get this, and the average day is 25.2 hours. And now the photoperiod goes through, and suddenly you can see how desperately the system tries to hook up every time it comes into phase. And it can't do it, and it breaks away. And then you also see that something happened here, which I still think with anybody who can get access to people who have such a behavior, please make them wear an actimeter, because what you will be able to do here is prove internal desynchronization, as Ashraf has done it in the bunker. Because what's happening here is that for some reason, the whole system jumps half a cycle. And what's behind this, and I'm not going to go into this, is very long days. Suddenly go into very long days. They almost duplicate the length of their behavioral days. And I bet you, if you take this behavior that you will find similar to the woman, the blind woman and her truck driver husband, that the melatonin rhythm and other physiological rhythms will still be somewhere around 25.5 and not 50-hour days. So internal desynchronization. If you go into the epidemiology, you will find that late types have a higher depression index than early types, but you can show that this is actually mostly due to the fact that they have a higher social jet lag. So that's what I mean by, if you let them sleep whenever they want, the late types, they will not necessarily develop a depression. And it's a question that is important to answer. And in a different study where we looked at a sleep score, which is called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, we found that it is so essential to ask what you do on which day, on a work day and the free day, because if you ask people what they usually do, they only give you the information about what they do in the majority of the days. Those are the work days, and you will not see the whole picture. And when we looked at these studies, we did analyses mediation analyses where we could separate out that it is very much more the influence of social jet lag than of being late. Anyhow, I'm going to skip these because they basically show nothing else, but that the best predictor for depression in the Quilombolas, depressive symptoms in Quilombolas, is light. And now you come into a pinch, because if you're depressed, you may not go outside, but if you don't go outside, you may get depressed. We still don't know the chicken and egg or hen and, is it hen and egg or chicken? What is it? Chicken. But chickens are male sometimes. Or not? Okay. I stop with something that is very, very trivial for anybody who does circadian work, but which is extremely important for people who do circadian work in the field and are not completely immersed in the circadian system. And that is, you have things, the physiological variables that over time go up and down. But now, if you do this on local time, you have different chronotypes. And they can be far apart. In modern society, the extreme lark and the extreme owl can be 12 hours apart. So if you do a measurement based on local time, you might find huge differences. And if you now have the odds that one of them, if you're unlucky and one of them is your control and the other one is your patient or your case, then you get yes, there's huge differences. But if you would align them to, let's say, time since mid-sleep on free days to their chronotype, you would find that the difference between the control and the patient is not there. So this is a very important thing. And along the same lines, these are identical chronotypes living at different portions of the time zone. And again, if you make a measurement based on local time, you get differences. And if you adjust for sun time, which is the third, it's social time, it's sun time, and it's biological time that you always have to reckon with. And if you don't play around with them, you might come to a very, very different conclusions. So, very, very short summary. A large body of literature shows links between clock, sleep, and pathology, including psychopathology. Light, chronotype, and social jet lag play essential roles in these relationships. I don't think having a late clock makes you sick. Having a late clock forcing you in our society to eat at the wrong time makes you sick. And long-term activity and light recordings can be very powerful tools and simple tools to get an overview of what's happening in an individual's temporal world and then make conclusions why this person might be prone to develop something. What I just said is that disease is political in many ways. Just look at daylight saving time. It's a political decision. And there's this wonderful essay a week ago, or almost a week ago, in the New York Times, which goes into mental health as politics. These are many of the people who I collaborate with all over the world, and I'm very thankful to them.